So today I'm going to share with you a recipe for a Christmas bread that has its roots in Czech tradition. It's called Hoska, and this is the finished product. So I'm giving you a little preview of it before we get started. But it's just an enriched bread that's super flavorful. It has a lemon glaze, dried fruit and nuts inside. It's so delicious. So I'm starting with 2 packets of rapid rise Fleischmann's yeast, and I'm just dumping that in probably like about a half a cup of water. It's warm water, so to get that yeast going, just whisk it around with a fork, or you can use an actual whisk if you want. Just kind of stir rapidly and get that yeast dissolved in the water. Next, we're going to add some sugar to the dissolved yeast and water mixture. And I actually use about a half a cup of white sugar typically, but I just have this raw cane sugar. I ran out of white sugar yesterday. Bad timing, but the raw cane sugar is still going to work just as well. It just takes a little bit longer to get that to dissolve than a granulated white sugar. So you're just going to stir that around and get that sugar dissolving in the yeast and water mixture, and then get everything else ready for your dough. So next thing you need is 2 cups of milk. You can use just regular milk. I just took this out of the fridge. Some people actually scald their milk first, but I didn't scald this milk. It works just fine. Then you're going to dump in a half a cup of butter and melted butter, and stir that around. Then you're going to add the yeast and sugar mixture, stir that in, and then whisk together an egg with about a teaspoon of salt. Just kind of beat that together lightly, and then you're going to incorporate this in with your sugar, yeast, water, milk, and melted butter mixture. The butter will create little teeny pieces because it cooled down with the milk, but you don't want this to be too hot. Once you add the yeast, you want to make sure that if you do scald your milk, you cool it down because you don't want to kill the yeast. Then you're going to dump in about 2 cups of flour or so, stir that around, add another cup of flour, just kind of keep adding flour. You're going to use probably a total of about 6 or so cups of flour for this recipe, but you want to add about half of it in this first stage to make a nice kind of battery soft dough, because you want it to rise. It's called a sponge when you kind of just do this with a rise before you knead it. And any kind of enriched dough, it definitely needs a little extra boost with the rising process to make sure that your bread does not turn out doughy. So the middle of the loaf should not be uncooked or doughy at all. It should be cooked all the way through when you're done, without having to burn the crust on the outside to get it cooked. So that means you've got to make sure that it rises properly. So this is the 3rd cup of flour that I'm adding, and then you can see it's starting to kind of form a dough because it's starting to swirl together. So it's getting thick enough to where this is enough flour. And once I finish stirring this up, what I'm going to do is just cover this and let it rise for probably about an hour for this rise, just to get it, get the yeast really going and get it started. So then while that's rising, you're going to go ahead and get your orange peel, almonds, and currants chopped. I also put in some nutmeg, some ginger, and a little bit of amaretto flavoring. So, and then zested the peel of an entire lemon. So that's kind of about a 1/3 to a half a cup of each of those things approximately, or kind of a little handful. So this is what your dough should look like after it's risen for about an hour. It should really be filling up that bowl. You can see that this is a very loose and soft dough, but it's very bubbly and it's gotten that yeast really working. So it is ready to add all of the really amazing flavors that are going into this bread. So this is a little bit of amaretto flavoring, as well as some ginger powder and a little bit of nutmeg, probably about 1/4 teaspoon of each. And I'm just going to clean that spoon off, and then we're going to also add about, well, this is the zest of an entire lemon, so one rather large lemon. And then about 1/2 cup maybe or so of chopped currants, or you could use raisins if that's all you have, about the same amount or so of chopped orange peel. Now the orange peel is just from one orange. And then about 1/2 cup of finely diced and chopped almonds. So you just want to add all of that goodness into your dough, and then we're going to stir that up and then add the rest of the flour. So you've added at this point about half of the flour that's needed for the recipe. And we're just going to add enough flour now to where we can actually knead the dough. And once we've kneaded it, so you can see it's just gonna have all that delicious flavor in every bite. So it smells so good. It smells like the holidays. So yeah, we're gonna go ahead and add flour to that, knead it up, and let it rise another time, and then we're gonna shape the dough. So make sure you add enough flour. Again, this is probably a total of about 6 cups or so. I didn't measure it exactly. Maybe like 1/2 bag of flour or so total. And then you're gonna sprinkle flour over your surface. Once your dough is, at the right consistency. This is what it should look like when it's coming out. So it's still soft and pliable, and it's going to be easy to knead, but it's nice and dough-like. It's no longer like a batter. It shouldn't be like running out. It should hold its shape once you plop it onto the surface, but not be so stiff that you can't easily kind of punch into it with your fist. So I like to punch into it with a fist and then turn it from the outside with my other hand. And this is just a technique that I have been doing since I was a little kid, basically, and could stand on a chair and reach the cupboard and punch the dough. So it's actually kind of therapeutic. I enjoy this part of bread making a lot because it's almost like you can work out your tension on the bread because you've got to incorporate more flour into it. So it's kind of a repetitive, active meditation sort of activity to do. So you might have seen me kind of poke the dough a little bit earlier. That's one way of just checking it while you're kneading it, making sure that it has the right amount of flour. You want it to, when poked, kind of bounce back a little bit, spring back. If it doesn't, then you haven't added enough flour. If it stays in, like you poke in and your finger just like the hole just stays in there. If you poke in and it springs back too fast, like it basically doesn't even leave an indentation, then you probably added too much flour and there's not much you can do at that point. But so just keep kind of poking it and seeing if it's the right consistency. And this looks like it is getting close to being done here. So we're going to get ready to put this in for its final, well, not final rise, the second rise. We have 3 rises on this bread because, again, it's an enriched dough, so you've got to really keep that yeast happy. So I'm going to add some oil to this bowl, and it's just the same bowl that the bread was already in. You don't have to clean it out. And then I'm going to plop that bread in and then turn it over so that the top has oil on the top. And I do this just to make sure that the bread doesn't stick to the damp tea towel that I'm going to put over top of that while it rises, because that's a big mess if it actually sticks to the tea towel. So your bread should look like this. You can see that orange peel and the lemon zest and the little currants, little almonds. It smells so good. And we're going to just let that rise, cover it up and let it rise for this time about 2 hours. So once your dough has risen a second time, it should be all the way to the top of that bowl, nice and fluffy. This is a 1.5 to 2 hour rise depending on your dough. So you can see how it's fluffy. It takes longer to rise just because it is an enriched dough, because it's got all that milk, butter, and all the fruit, nuts, peels, flavorings in there. So what we're going to want to do is just kind of gently pound it down a little bit. I'm going to take about 2/3 of the dough, and this is going to be my big braid. So I'm going to do one big braid to make the bottom. So I'm going to basically then divide this into 3 parts, because of course braids have 3 parts, and then roll out these guys into just kind of long, kind of almost like long snakes or something, like long ropes of dough. And the dough shouldn't be overly sticky. Like, you don't really need a lot of flour to work with it at this point. You could lightly dust your hands with flour. But you want these ropes to be nice and long, because when we braid, we want this loaf to braid up to equal a length of a cookie sheet. So get your ropes. Here's the one, and we're gonna just do the big one first. Then we're gonna put on top of that braid, we're gonna put another smaller braid, and then I'm gonna add, just for fun, a couple little micro braids just for decoration. So you want to make sure that your ropes are all the same length. So we've got 2 there, and this is the 3rd one. Again, you want to make sure that your hands and the surface are lightly floured, but you don't want to work in a whole bunch of extra flour right now into this dough, because you don't want it to become stiff. You can feel that it's just nice and light, and even though it's an enriched dough, it's still very like light and pliable. So we've got 3 ropes here. Those are going to be the main braid. And then with the remaining, I'm going to divide it again into 2/3 and 1/3. And then take this little piece and divide it into 3 equal, presumably equal parts. And then make out of that, you guessed it, 3 more ropes. So you're just basically making long ropes because these are going to be braids. That's what makes this bread really beautiful, is that it has these braided pieces. So it's like a big fat braid at the bottom, a thinner braid at the top, and then some little decorative braids on the sides. So you can tell that these ropes are much smaller than those ones. And when you finish with all of your ropes, we're gonna just let them kind of set for probably about 15 minutes or so, just to make sure that they're getting in the mood to rise. And then we're gonna braid them, and then we're gonna let that bread rise one last and final time before baking. So we're getting close. This is a little bit of a long process. That's why it's a holiday bread, because I don't want to make this all the time just for a regular day, because it kind of does take longer than a typical yeast bread, because it's of that enriched dough and all those flavors going on. So we're getting close. So we've got 3 of those little guys, and then we're going to take that last little ball and divide it again into 3 pieces, 3 sections. And you want those sections to be as uniform as possible. And then with this, I'm just going to make a very thin, almost breadstick-like piece of rope. It's fine if it splits a little bit, because we're going to make some little micro braids on the sides. Kind of running out of space in my very small cupboard here. All right, just keep going with the remainder of that. So this is the most fun part of the process. You're gonna lay out your 3 big pieces onto your greased cookie sheet, and just go ahead and pinch the ends together, kind of tuck them under, and then you're gonna want to start braiding. So just do a basic braid. This is an over braid, meaning that we're wrapping the pieces over top of one another. Under braids go, of course, under. There are different types of braids in hair and in bread. So it should be a piece that is long enough to reach from one end to the other end of that cookie sheet, nice and neatly. And then we're going to take the other 3 pieces, these guys, and for that, I actually like to braid that just on the countertop and then place it on top of that bigger braid. So I'm just gonna lay these out and pinch their ends together. Braid, again, over. And just kind of be careful to hold the dough so that it's not stretching out too far as you go. You don't wanna like get one piece stretched out way longer than the other ones or whatever. So you're just braiding that up. And then you're going to pinch those ends together. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna put this on top of this other braid. So we've got one braid, and now we're going to put the smaller braid right on top, and it reaches all the way to the end. And then we have these smaller yet tiny little braids. So it's gonna be like a triple braid, basically, is what we're making. So I'm just gonna go ahead and again lay these out, 3 equal strands. Pinch the ends together, as you probably guessed already. And again, braid. Now this time, the braid is gonna be even smaller, and it's gonna be really tight and close to your hands as you go. But nonetheless, it is still the same process as the other 2 previous braids. You just wanna make sure that your braid is even. As you go along, try and make sure that the thickness of the dough stays uniform. And
it was about at this point that I actually decided that I'm just going to do the small braid on top of the large and medium braids instead of doing micro braids on the sides of the large braid. But you can do whatever design you want with this. Obviously, it's just braided dough, so be creative.
That small one right on the top. So we've got a little bit of a tall stack here. It is going to bake fine, but we do need to let it rise one more time until about doubled. So we're just gonna watch it as it rises, making sure that everything stays together and holds together. And then right before we bake it, we're going to brush it with an egg yolk and a little bit of milk kind of mixture, just to brush it to make it nice and golden brown when it bakes. So this is what it looks like from the top when you're setting it out to rise for the final time. We're going to let it rise about 45 minutes. I like to loosely cover it with saran wrap just to make sure that the surface of the dough doesn't dry out while it's rising. So this rose for about 45 minutes to an hour, and I'm just brushing like the egg yolk and milk mixture. It's just one egg yolk beaten with probably like a few spoonfuls of milk or so, and just brush that all the way over the dough on the top and the sides of the braids, and then put it in the oven, and it's going to bake beautifully. It's already starting to get golden brown. You want to bake it until it is golden brown all the way around. If you need to put a little foil on top of that top braid to protect it from getting too dark, you can, depending on how your oven works and where your racks are. And then once you get it out, put it onto cooling racks. And oh, by the way, you also want to make sure that it sounds hollow. It should be brown, and also when you tap it, it should sound kind of hollow. So then I just took the juice of one lemon and some powdered sugar and whisked that up with a little fork. And that is the glaze that I drizzled over the entire braided bread. So this is Hoska. It looks so delicious. And now I have to cut it open to see what the crumb is like on the inside, because the real test is to make sure that it is not doughy and that it's delicious, of course. As you can see, I'm enjoying it. That outer crust should be just like so flaky and decadent, and then on the inside it's just super soft. And I'm gonna slice it down the middle, and you can see that once it's sliced down the middle, it actually looks great in the middle as well. So there was no doughiness or underdoneness. It turned out really well. So I think I baked it for about 45 minutes, but you just want to watch it again for that hollow sound and that golden brown look to the crust to make sure that it is all the way done. So I'm just going to divide it in half, cut it down the middle, and wrap it, in two halves, just because otherwise the saran wrap gets so super long. So I hope you try it out and enjoy it. If you've never had Hoska before, it is delicious. The other three things I remember from the grandfather who actually came over here I think it was my dad's dad that came here when he was 19 from the Czech Republic. So Hoska, one, kolaches is another little bread, kind of little pastry thing that we used to make. And then I remember that how are you sounds like yuck some mush, so it's like yuck shamash is how are you. And then the fourth thing is potato farming, because they were potato farmers and that's why they came to America, to try and find a better life. But thick, short potato farmers in the Czech Republic. So I'm the tallest woman in the family, which is kind of crazy because I'm 5'3". But enough about that. Here is my Hoska recipe. Hope you enjoy.